So I looked at attitudes within One Nation and tried to compare One Nation with other major political parties and try to understand the extent to which One Nation is similar or different. And I found that on issues to do with social justice, economic issues, government making a difference to people's lives, One Nation is not all that different from, say, Labor and the Greens in wanting to see what we could call progressive change. But when it comes to disenchantment with government and with immigration, cultural diversity, on those sort of issues, One Nation was very much at the end of the spectrum on its own. So the level of disenchantment with governments, the low level of trust, the willingness to consider non-democratic alternatives to our present system, and then also in negative feeling with regard to current immigration intake and the extent of diversity in our communities. On those sort of issues, One Nation was much more negative than the mainstream. Yes, I found the discussion very interesting, and for me a major issue is that you can't easily put people in the one category. So if we want to look at populist movements, and that was a theme of this morning's discussion, there's quite a range amongst populist movements, and even amongst the supporters of populist movements, they don't all neatly fit into the one category. So some people have quite extreme views, others are somewhat sort of mixed. So I think that was an important issue.
I'm Simon Kneebone. I'm a freelance cartoonist here at the Colloquium today. I'm here to, the role's a bit vague, I guess. It's graphically record or somehow illustrate the goings on, which I'll sort of interpret in my own way, which is manage a cartoon what I think are, or seem to be the main points that come out from the presentations and discussions and things like that. So, yeah, I usually think of it a bit like being at a lecture or at school or something where you underline the main points. I'm always trying to find the key points that speak for what's being discussed, and then try and get them into a picture somehow. And if you're lucky, something will fall in your lap that hangs together as a little moment that you can capture on a bit of paper.
And what are some of the themes?
Well, I guess the main theme is right-wing groups, but what's coming out is that the whole diverse range of right-wing groups, some of them which may only exist on the internet, and they don't seem to actually be genuine political groups, but rather more angry, disgruntled outlets for people, which attracts a lot of people who have a lot to grumble about. So I've been surprised that, because I was thinking earlier, we live in our own little bubbles, our cocoons. We choose our friends, what we read, and now I'm realising there's a whole other world going on out there that is a little bit scary. It could be quite a lot scary. And how would you tackle it? How would you speak to someone from that point of view? And how would you say something that would perhaps make them think? And they've got me thinking quite fast. What is going on here? So it's quite an eye-opening morning. The afternoon will be really good too. Might have answers.
I'm Tom Clark and I work in the first year college at Victoria University, talking about what communities notice in extreme and far right-wing rhetoric about them. So when people from the far right talk about the Islamic community, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender community, what have you, what is it that these people notice is being said about them? What do they make of that? It's really hard to generalise from the kind of research that works for rhetoric reception normally. So we've got some pretty reliable ways to get at what people think about what public figures are saying most of the time. You know, like mainstream politicians, for example, then ordinary members of the community feel quite empowered just to tweet about that or post about that on Facebook or what have you. In this case, when people are under attack, we're seeing a lot less. We're seeing a lot less commentary about what's happening to them in publicly accessible spaces. So they must be talking about it, but they're not talking about it in ways that are publicly accessible, and so they're probably not getting like a whole of community sense of what other people in their communities of interest think about it.
Okay, great. And any other comments on the discussion in general?
It's been amazing. The bringing together of academic research and community practitioner has really highlighted a sense of urgency around a situation that feels, you know, quite volatile and could be very dangerous if things are just allowed to spin out of control.
I'm Julie Rudner. I'm from the Community Planning and Development Program at La Trobe University. So I teach and do research on cities.
Okay, great. And so what angle did you come at the topic from?
I was looking at what happened in Bendigo when there were protests over the proposal for a mosque in the city. And in particular, to add to this conversation, I was looking at the spatial aspects, how people use space, how they respond to architecture, and how the building of architecture changes our understanding of the urban fabric, but also when you have big issues like migration, or for the protesters, people who do not want Muslim people in their town, what happens when they interact with the planning system, which is structured in particular ways, which doesn't take into their considerations, because planning is not the place to discuss who belongs and who doesn't belong in Australia.
Great, okay. I'm just going to adjust your mic,
Yeah.
sorry, because it's moving around.
Is it? That's because I move around, I think.
No, it's because it was in a precarious position.
That wasn't very articulate, sorry.
No, it was good.
Was it?
Do you want to just try your presentation?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was. Oh yeah. So I was discussing whether mosque protesters were actually participating in a democratic process or hijacking the planning system because of the types of actions that they took in order to try to stop the mosque development.
Okay, cool. And is that, are there many people kind of looking at this topic from a planning point of view?
No, I'm probably one of the few people, and I think that's probably why I was asked today. This is mostly being looked at, I think, from sociology perspectives or psychological perspectives in terms of racism, but particularly in terms of looking at the spatial aspects and planning regulation. I don't think there's many at the moment.
Okay, great. Was there anything that was particularly interesting that's come out of the discussion today? Not even just about your topic, but anything.
Oh, I'd have to think really hard.
Or just a general reflection is fine.
No, I can't answer that right now. My mind's gone blank. I'm really sorry.
No, that's fine. What you ready? Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the most interesting things to come out of this and also other research is the diversity of communities and the way that they're no longer able to be divided into left wing or right wing or let's say racist or non-racist, because they go after particular issues and they have different motivations to participate, and so because of that you just can't make assumptions. So with right-wing groups who might be against something like a mosque, they can be have people from all these different cultures and religions who are part of that, so it's not as clean cut in terms of communication and to find out what people really want.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just go ahead.
My name is Dvir Abramovich. I'm chairman of the Anti-Defamation Commission. We're a civil rights organization established some 40 years ago. Our mission is to fight hatred in all its forms and to promote understanding and tolerance in our community.
Right, and what was your main message today?
So we talked about the surge in anti-Semitism over the last few years, but also a resurgence in white supremacist and neo-Nazi activities across the nation. We are tremendously concerned about a right-wing white supremacist group that feels emboldened and energized. And we outline some of the initiatives and the educational programs that we run in order to counter this scourge and in order to fight the virus of bigotry. I found this conference and this gathering to be quite inspiring because it meant that I was standing shoulder to shoulder with other activists, researchers, academics, and people on the front line who are determined and are committed to fighting the cancer of racism, coming up with innovative ideas, talking about their own research and about their own initiatives to make this country a better place and to make sure that no minority, that nobody is vilified or maligned because of the color of their skin or the house of prayer that they attend or because of their background or surname.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Green. I'm an editor, a broadcaster journalist, and I was facilitating, I think you would say, today, this event.
Great. And can you give
Well, about defining the far right in this country. Where are they? What are their modes of communication? How do they coalesce as a political, as a social group? What are their ideas? What influence are they having on mainstream politics? What's the nature of their politics? These were a lot of the threads. Then we moved into how those politics then have community effect. And we looked at that across a range of social... Oh, we're going underneath. Sorry, better wing it.
what was the actual topic that today was called?
Far right narratives was the topic today, and the first job was to sort of define those groups and to look at perhaps not so much the far right, but the everyday voice of the right, groups like One Nation, and see how that represents a body of sort of far right opinion, and whether one feeds off the other, whether one is the normalisation of a more extreme view. And we picked on from there to look at some of the ways in which online environment encourages some of these ideas, the places online where the right lives, how it communicates, the nature of the ideas it communicates. We saw some of the European experience as well as things that are happening in Australia, and there are clear parallels in those sorts of channels of communication and the bodies of like minds that are formed. We moved on after that to look at the effect that this has in various community groups, whether those be ethnic communities or the queer community in this country, which is in itself a victim of far-right activism. We looked at that and then perhaps some of the responses that might be made. And some of those were really intricate and dealing with what's often an online culture in that online environment of finding ways in which to talk to people, to engage them in conversation, to challenge their ideas, and not just a shouting match, but in a more considered and argumentative, discursive way, looking at political responses, looking at the way in which, I guess, and this was perhaps the take-out message in terms of response from the day's conversations, was the way in which people needed to work together to sort of have a coherent way of tackling this, and to see the abuse against one group as the abuse against all, and that was perhaps the fundamental lesson from this, is that it's a problem for all of us, and that all of us, have a role in handling.
Okay, great. And just to summarise, what kind of people attended today?
The gamut. There were representatives from all sorts of ethnic, religious groups, academics with particular lines of interest in areas as diverse as online sort of sub-communities and planning issues. Because this is a cultural thing which has all sorts of manifestations. So it was a really broad room. Government, police, community, everybody was there. It's changing our political landscape, and it's changing our social landscape. The ideas that we see, just a group like One Nation, if you look at the way in which a political group like that can license a public conversation which is Islamophobic. That is a subtle shift in our politics, and a thing that we just can't go unobserved and unremarked and unchallenged. So conversations like this one are very important to start to prepare a vocabulary against that sort of social shift, to analyse it, to see why that's taking place, to work towards something which is going to work towards social cohesion, which is the ultimate destructive power of some of these ideas that we've been discussing is to work against that social cohesion, is to pull us apart.
Right. Anything else?
No.